Here are the top 13 tips I wish someone had explained to me before I started oil painting. What's the difference between solvent and medium, and when should we use one or the other? Like many things in life, I learned this one the hard way. Solvent and medium both make the paint more fluid, but they are far from the same. Solvent works by breaking down the binder that holds the paint together, making it more fluid. The solvent evaporates quickly, leaving behind a thin layer of paint, but this layer is uneven and grainy. But it dries more quickly because there's less paint to dry, and so it's perfect for underpaintings or layers that will be covered up with other layers of paint. Medium, on the other hand, is generally, but not always, a type of oil, and it makes the paint, well, oilier. It changes the ratio between pigment to oil, but this means that it takes much longer to dry. I learned this when I tried to do an underpainting with medium and couldn't understand why a month later it still wasn't dry. This is because oil takes a lot longer to dry. But it creates nice, beautiful, clean, smooth layers of paint, which can be added over previous layers. And remember, when you're painting with medium or solvent, or just oil paints in general, make sure that your room is well ventilated. I use these non-toxic mediums and solvents, but still, ventilation is important. Don't run straight to medium. The paint that comes out of the tube is that consistency for a reason. You can use solvent for your underpainting. Your first true layer should be paint that comes straight from the tube. If you start your painting directly by mixing medium into your oil paint, it won't have that nice, rich look that oil paints are known for. Oil paints should have a nice, thick, creamy, rich texture when they come out of the tube. And be careful, because the first time I ever tried painting with oils, I bought a bad batch of oil paint. Half the tubes I bought were mostly oil, while the other half were so hard I had to physically squeeze the tube with all my might to try and get the paint out. But I painted with it anyway because I was a complete beginner and I didn't know any better. I bought it from a reputable brand, from a reputable store, and so I thought it would be fun. I don't know what happened. But for your next layers, for the sake of the integrity of your painting, you'll need to use medium. And that brings us to the rule of fat over lean. We often hear that the most fundamental rule in oil painting is fat over lean. But what does this actually mean? For me, this name was always very counterintuitive, but I eventually learned to think of it as fat equals oil, and so oilier paint over less oily paint. So if you want to paint in multiple layers, it should go something like this. Paint plus solvent, paint, paint plus medium, paint plus more medium. So what happens if we don't follow this rule? The more oil there is in your paint, the longer it will take to dry. Think about it. Have you ever waited for a patch of oil to dry compared to literally anything else? Oil paint is exactly the same. And this is because the oil doesn't dry by evaporation. It dries by a chemical process when it comes into contact with oxygen. Because of this, the oil paint shifts ever so slightly as it dries. If you have an oilier layer, or fatter layer, underneath a less oily layer, or a leaner layer, then the leaner layer will dry first. And so when the fattier layer does dry, it causes the lean, now dry upper layer to shift and crack. Think of it like a house. If your foundation shifts, your house is going to crack. But be careful, there's a big difference between touch dry and actually dry. Touch dry can take a few hours to a few days, depending on the amount of paint, solvent, or medium that you've used. But actually dry can take from 6 months, even up to a year. And remember, if you couldn't care less about cracking and just want to experiment with the paint, just ignore this rule and come back to it when you feel ready. Not everything you paint needs to be archival quality. But when you do apply layers, be careful, because not all paint is created equally. How your layers come out will largely depend on the paint's transparency. You may or may not have heard of the terms glazing and scumbling. And maybe you've noticed a little icon on the paint tube, depending on the brand. Or, when you go to buy the paints, you see that the samples are either solid colors, but some have gradients. Everything comes down to the paint transparency. On my paints, it's indicated by a little square on the paint tube, but this can vary depending on the brand. While paint transparency can vary depending on the brand, it mainly varies by pigment. So why should we care? When you think about it, it can seem obvious, but I feel like this is a topic that's not explained enough, and it's something that's quite easy to overlook if you don't know it's there. Or at least, I missed it at first. But it means exactly what the name would suggest. How transparent is the paint? How well can you see previous layers when you apply this paint on top of it? When you apply the paint straight from the tube, it's not that noticeable. That being said, when I paint without an underpainting, yes, I do that sometimes, I make sure that I'm using opaque paint so to not let the canvas show through underneath my paint. But it's most important when you're mixing paint with medium. If your paint is transparent and you've mixed it with a lot of medium, your layers underneath will show through well. This is perfect for adding or deepening hues, for example. This technique is known as glazing. But if your paint is opaque and mixed with medium, your layers underneath will show through to some extent, but will mostly be covered. This is perfect for adding mist, for example. This technique is known as scumbling. And speaking of techniques, until now, we've spoken about the wet on dry technique. This implies waiting for previous layers to be touch dry before adding the next layer. If you've heard of the term alla-prima, this is the same thing as wet on wet. Painting wet on dry is in theory better for realistic paintings, and painting wet on wet is in theory better for impressionist paintings. But I'd really encourage you to try both and see which method suits you better. Personally, I paint realism and I prefer to paint wet on wet for two main reasons. First and foremost, I like the fact that I can manipulate the paint underneath to some extent. It's easier to muddy your colours when painting wet on wet, but once you understand this, it'll become so much easier. And the secret is actually pretty simple. The harder you press, the more your colours will mix. So if you want your new paint to mix with the layer that's already on your canvas, press on it with a moderate amount of pressure, and the two will mix together. You don't need to press hard, just firmly. Don't go making holes in your canvas. If you want your new paint to sit on top of your previous layer, load your brush up with your paint, don't be stingy, and lightly drag your brush across the top of your previous layer. This will allow the new paint to sit on top of the previous wet layer without mixing in. I prefer this method because after a bit of practice, I personally find it much easier to blend the paint to the degree that I want it. If I'm honest, I do a mix of both methods. I do the majority of my painting wet on wet, and then if there's any area that I want to change or correct, I can go back in later with wet on dry. And because I tend to paint section by section, the fat over lean rule is the bane of my existence. But with wet on wet, I can mostly ignore that. I just like to finish, or mostly finish, a section before moving on to the next. There are so many colours out there. Which ones should you pick? The short answer is ultramarine blue, cadmium red, cadmium yellow, burnt umber, titanium white. With these colours, you can mix nearly any colour. Now I say nearly because there are some very vivid colours like cyan or magenta that can't be mixed. But this is true for any art medium. Now I say cadmium, but I'd recommend cadmium free or cadmium imitation paints. This is because cadmium itself is toxic. Now in theory, cadmium paint is safe to use, but I personally prefer the alternatives because I'd rather be absolutely sure. And I also have 3 dogs and I wouldn't put it past them to try and eat my paint. I don't think they would, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. Now the proper answer to the question, what paints should I use, is it depends. You should take into account the transparency of the paint, especially, for example, if you're glazing or scumbling. But painting isn't about using the colours from the tube. It's about using these paints to mix the nuances you want. There are so many different pigments available, because afterwards, a lot of these just become shortcuts. If you learn to mix your colours, you will have so much more control over your paintings, and will understand the basics much better, and this will allow you to build up your paintings into something really great. You'll have a level of control that you just can't get from using paints straight from the tube without mixing them. Limiting your palette will also give you a greater harmony throughout your painting. If you're interested in learning how to mix colors, fine-tune them to match the painting, as well as general color theory tips, I made an in-depth video where I explain everything I know. I'm not going to tell you to never use black. Black has its place, but even then, you should generally be mixing your own blacks. But unless you really know what you're doing, you shouldn't rely on black to desaturate your colors, which means make them more grey. You should rather use the complementary color, which is the color opposite on the color wheel. But don't add more than necessary. The more you add, the more desaturated the color will become. And please don't use black to make your colors darker. This is the #1 reason why colors look dull, grey and unrealistic. In real life, most shadows are vibrant. You can use colors like ultramarine blue, burnt umber and crimson red to darken your shadows. In my color mixing video, I explain all of this in detail, including why it works, and we take a look at a few examples and demonstrations. Do you ever find yourself trying to mix a bright orange, but your orange mixed from the red and yellow out of the tube is too dark, so you mix it with white and it just comes out chalky? Earlier in this video, I mentioned specific shades of red, blue and yellow. And I picked these specific colors because not all pigments are created equally. Some are much more vibrant than others and maintain their vibrancy much better, even when mixed with white. This is why cadmium paints are so popular, despite cadmium being toxic. But today we have cadmium-free alternatives, so that's awesome. I've never used the true cadmium paints, and the imitations have never let me down. If this video has helped you at all, consider subscribing for more painting tips and tutorials. If you have any questions, or if there's something you'd like to see in more detail, leave a comment down below. The eye is naturally drawn to areas with high contrast. If you want your viewer to focus on a specific area of your painting, this is where you should add the most contrast and detail. For example, in this painting, the most contrast and detail is in the wolf's face, where I want the viewer's eye to be drawn, followed by its body, which has some contrast and detail, but much less than the face. And then there's the background, which I purposefully blurred. Once you understand this, your paintings will really go to the next level. If you want to add detail everywhere, that's fine too. There are no rules. It's just something that you should be aware of so that you can make informed decisions in your artwork. Okay, so this one sounds obvious, but it's probably the most difficult. Let this be a reminder to all painters, beginners and professionals. Clean your brushes while the paint is still fresh. I get it. You've finished painting for the day, you're tired, you have other things to do. I fall into the same trap all the time. The "it'll be fine, I'll get to it later" trap. This is my graveyard of "it'll be fine, I'll get to it later." They've been this way for years. Don't be me. Clean your brushes. I'm begging you. I might try some different techniques to restore these brushes and see if anything works. Let me know if you'd be interested in a video like that. I have two methods of cleaning my brushes. If I've forgotten about them for a while, I soak them in this and it tends to soften them a bit and make them easier to clean. Otherwise, I use this brush soap with a bit of lukewarm water. I rub the brushes gently and make sure I'm not bending the bristles. Afterwards, I reshape them while they're still drying. Most of the time, I don't clean my brushes while painting, but I always have my paper towel, which I use to wipe off my brush. I generally have one brush for dark colors and one for light. The only time that I'd really use a perfectly clean brush is if I want paint that's very dark or very light. There are no rules as to how you must learn to paint. If copying helps you, then copy. If you want to trace your planning sketch, then trace it. This might be a controversial opinion, but as long as you're honest about it and credit the original artist, and don't try and pass off a copy as an original work, there isn't a problem. If you want to show it to other people, whether it's online or in person, just make sure you give credit to the original artist. Or just keep it for yourself as a measure of your own progress. But if you're going to copy, do so with intention. Find one or two things about the painting that you like, whether it be composition, lighting, value, control, etc., and just focus on that. Then try to apply it to your own work. You can learn to paint by painting anything, even complicated paintings. You don't have to start by painting spheres. I tried, I got bored very quickly, and I didn't want to do it. I'm not going to show you my first oil painting because it's not a fair comparison, but it's on my channel if you're interested. I started off with pencils and colour pencils, and by the time I moved to paint, I already understood a lot of the basics of art. This is one of my first portraits, which I did right before COVID hit. It's awful. But when I took up art again after COVID, I decided to focus on something specific each time I drew. Eventually, I decided not to abandon my drawing before I was happy with it, relative to my skill level at the time. I only drew portraits because that's what interested me. This is the same portrait 5 years later. Painting what I wanted motivated me to learn faster. There are no rules as how you must learn to paint. Do what works for you, and most importantly, give yourself permission to learn. You're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. It's a part of the learning process. The next time, you'd have learned from those mistakes, and your art will only improve. And whatever you do, don't give up.